Chapter 15. The Spring Wind of Chairman Mao thought. The time came for peasants to teach us. Poor father. He was totally unaccustomed to labor and made a fool of himself over and over again. In the early spring, the only major work was spreading fertilizer, mostly night soil, and the chemicals bought with father's investment. The mucky pond bottom was another rich resource, though sticky and black with dead fish and plant life. We were supposed to carry our shoulder poles down the dirty steps that had been carved in the bank and go right into the stuff to our knees. There we'd hook on 2 baskets loaded with mud and carry them back up and out to the fields, running with that low, even stride, which is the only comfortable way to carry an extremely heavy burden. I was strong and learned quickly, but father never mastered it. I remember him the first day, arriving serious and earnest, his pants rolled up above his knees and his soft feet red with cold, eager to learn from the peasants. But before he made it safely into the muddy slope at the bottom, he slipped on the rounded little steps and flew ingloriously to his destination. Bottom first. Everyone laughed, of course, but Guo, luckily wealth, reproved him, saying, "What would you do if you were asked to make speeches like old Liang? We could beat your asses with a stick 3 times and wouldn't get a fart out of you." Father smiled good-naturedly. "Never mind," he said. "If I work hard, eventually I'll get it." After this first fall, he went all the way home to change his pants. He did so again after the second, but after the third he had nothing to change into, and worked, as he was, muddy from head to toe, but safe on the pond bottom loading baskets. Despite such blunders, father seemed more at peace with himself and the world than I have ever seen him. He became talkative again, smiled often, and sometimes even hummed under his breath. The exercise was evidently good for him, for he looked younger than he had since before the Cultural Revolution began. He was a little sad, though, as he discovered the depth of the peasants' day-to-day misery. Theirs was a poverty he had only touched upon as a reporter. He had been shielded from it by being shepherded from place to place by cadres who treated him as an honored guest. It was a cruel reality, very different from the one he had envisaged as he read documents and newspapers in the comfort of his office. Where was the liberation from suffering the revolution had advertised so proudly? Living in the No. 9 production team was a shock for me too, for neither Uncle Ho's nor Cousin Han's team had been so poor. The Goose Cord commune had a long history of misery, and in the early 1960s, many had died here. The land had been exhausted by years of intensive cultivation and inadequate fertilizers. It grew barely enough rice to feed the team, but even so, the peasants had to turn most of it over to the government. They had a saying that summed up the situation very neatly. During the first half of the year, we grew rice for the government. During the second half, we wait for emergency relief. Many things made more sense to me now. I understood, for example, that the peasants produced babies the way a chicken produces eggs because their basic food allotment would be increased with each new family member. Then the rice would be redistributed to those who needed it most, the active men. The women and children sacrificed their portions to keep the best laborers fit and made do with sweet potatoes and sweet potato leaves. The peasants' real source of income was the paltry 20 yuan they received for each pig they sold to the government. If this money was hoarded carefully for 10 years or more, it might conceivably buy someone a bride. Even in those days, 300 or 400 yuan was a minimum price. In our team, marriage was out of the question for at least 8 of the middle-aged men, and a new house, even one with a straw roof, had only 800 yuan, hadn't been built for years. The only other money came from the chicken and duck eggs, which sold for 5 fen apiece at the commune center. With this, there might be enough for a little oil or salt. No wonder Cousin Han had rarely cooked with oil. We didn't have to look beyond our own hosts and neighbors, Guo Lucky Wealth and his wife, for constant reminders of the desperation of these lives. The man's name was a mockery. How embarrassingly splendid our ordinary city furniture suddenly looked. The couple had only an old wardrobe, a rickety table, and a bed that looked like it would collapse at any moment. They slept under a cotton quilt that they had inherited from old Guo's father. It was black with grease and age, and most of the stuffing had fallen out. Between the two of them, they had only one whole pair of pants, which they shared and reserved for days when one of them went on to market in the commune center. As for food, they often put the rice hulls the government issued as pig feed on their own tables, giving their own sweet potato leaves to the pigs. It was not surprising that the government often complained that their pigs were underweight. Every time old Guo took a pig to market, he fed it watered-down slop to bloat his belly and plugged its anus with cloth to keep it from losing precious pondage. Even so, officials usually sent it back again, but none of this poverty was unusual. Things in the house across the way had reached such a crisis that the old man in the family, feeling himself too much of a burden, had killed himself the previous summer during planting season, hanging himself from the storage ledge. There was little opportunity to see better worlds, much less move away from this one. Less than a third of the people had ever been to the town, only 11 li away, and perhaps a tenth had been farther, to the country seat. The only possible means of escape was to become a soldier, the coveted, though temporary, honor given to a few strong young men. Military service took them to Peking, Shanghai, and the border areas, and then, when it was over, thrust them cruelly back into their misery. Back at home, there were authorities on everything, but sadly unsatisfied. They looked enviously at the young men coming up who had not yet served, and cursed those still on active duty as ankle rubbers, toadies of the military commanders. Father fully expected that officials would criticize his work during the first few weeks, but he was shocked and a bit hurt by old Dai's complaints. "Other cadres are doing much more than you," asserted the company leader. "Weren't you told that the peasants were to make reports in the evening as well as ask for strength in the morning? Weren't you told to establish a study room?" Father shifted unhappily in his seat and took a hard swallow of hot tea. "But the peasants don't even eat dinner until 9, he said. They'd be exhausted." Old Dai looked Father up and down, his red star prominent over his small face. "Chairman Mao teaches us to bear hardship," he replied dryly. So the next morning, after the asking for strength ceremonies, Father had the peasants move the sweet potatoes in the storehouses up to the second level. With Zhujidao's help, he cut paper loyalty hearts for every member of the production team and pasted them up on a wall with spaces next to them to record punctuality and participation at meetings. He put up new posters of Mao and Lin and painted a slogan on every wall. Then he announced that beginning now, according to commune directive, everyone was to attend evening study meetings or their work points would be docked. To his surprise, the peasants were delighted to come despite the lateness. The storeroom became a center of life in the team, a forum for working out disputes and making plans. Father read every evening from the newspapers and answered questions about what he read. For people who had never been past the mountain barriers at their doorsteps, it was a rare chance to learn about what lay in the world beyond. I enjoyed Father's status as teacher, and I had my opportunities to show off as well. I recounted countless times the stories of my glimpse of Chairman Mao in Peking, elaborating new details for the pleasure of my rapt audience. Of course, sometimes the peasants asked questions that neither Father nor I could answer, just like why Chairman Mao wanted to attack Liu Shaoqi. Liu was a long-standing favorite in the countryside because his policies of more private plots, more free markets, more enterprises with their own responsibility for profits and loss, and quotas fixed on a household basis, had stimulated the economy and made the peasants richer after the natural disasters just after the Great Leap Forward. But how could we defend him when the whole country was mobilized against him? Still, the discussion was always lively, often ending after midnight. We finished with our reports and made 3 more bows to Mao and Lin, babies awakening and gurgling on their sisters' backs as if they were being given a water buffalo ride. But a few weeks later, Father was told it still wasn't enough. Why wasn't he using every moment of the day to instruct the peasants, and Chairman Mao thought, demanded old Dai. In the other teams, the cadres brought their works into the fields. That evening, in front of more than 100 pairs of eyes, Father turned to Chairman Mao and said, "I'm sorry, great helmsman. I have wronged you. I haven't done enough to bring the spring wind of your thought to number 9 production team." Before he could go on, a chorus of voices interrupted him. "No, Chairman Mao, it's not true. Old Liang is a good man. He's made our team very beautiful, putting up quotations from your work everywhere. He's brought us a lot of knowledge and never asks us to feed him or bring him wine to drink like the other cadres. He's come from such good surroundings all the way to our poor team to teach us." It wasn't until that moment that I realized how deeply the peasants had taken Father into their hearts. By that time, the rice seedlings were a hand-hide in their carefully tended beds, yellow and green like an emperor's coverlet. They were now being tied to bunches with pieces of straw, carried away in baskets, and thrown out into the big fields to be transplanted. The peasants took a bunch at a time in one hand and, using the fore and middle fingers in the others as pincers, planted the shoots in the mud under water 6 inches deep. They could stand with bent backs for hours, working at the rate of 2 plants a second. Father, Zhu Zhidao, or I worked more slowly than a peasant child of 5 or 6. After old Dai's second criticism, Father was spared an aching back but waded through the fields now, making his way from one person to the next, reading in his loudest voice from the works of Chairman Mao. Sometimes he recited slogans rhythmically so as to set a pace for all the workers. 下定决心，不怕牺牲，排除万难，争取胜利。Make a resolution. Don't fear sacrifice. Drive out 10,000 troubles and achieve victory. At noon, when the peasants rested, Father had them all sit together and listen to recent edicts. He became an expert in the application of the quotations to all situations. If there was an argument, it was, "Unite to seek even greater victory." If people were tired at the end of the day, it was, "When comrades are in difficulty, they should think of their achievements and of the light ahead so they can summon up all their courage." Father never took rest even in bad weather. "Political work is the lifeline of economic work," he would intone, holding his little red book up near his glasses to shelter it from the rain under his conical peasant hat. Or, beneath the midday sun, "Under no circumstances should one forget class struggle, the dictatorship of the proletariat, reliance on the poor and low-middle peasants, the policy of the party, and the work of the party," he would declare, his face red from the heat, his white shirt so wet with sweat that it stuck transparently to his chest. It wasn't until we had been in the countryside several months and I have turned 15 that party policies forced Father once again to wrestle with himself. This time, it was the final battle. The tension was between his loyalty to the party and his sympathy for the peasants. The first step in cutting off the tail of capitalism in the countryside had been to instruct the peasants in revolutionary thought. The second step was to apply that thought by enforcing specific policies. It was in the early summer that he was summoned to an old landlord's moss-covered brick home in the town. For 4 days, he listened to leaders from the Changling County Revolutionary Committee sum up the favorable situation in the countryside, and outline the rules for the work that lay ahead. He came home looking a bit unhappy, and after a few evening meetings, I realized why. As it had been in the city, the main slogan was struggle, criticize, reform. But here the emphasis was somewhat different. Struggle meant to struggle against capitalist thought, which is Liu Shaoqi's notions of big private plots and more economic freedom, for example. Criticize means to criticize capitalist tendencies, like the desire to make money by raising pigs, chickens, and ducks, and by selling things at farmers' markets. Reform meant learning from Da Zhai, the model agricultural commune in the north, where work points depended on good political performances, and class struggle was life's main theme. Those first few days, people always came to our house after the meeting. Old Liang, they said, "We don't understand. Why is raising chickens and ducks rotten capitalism? How can we buy oil and salt if we don't sell eggs?" One 35-year-old bachelor complained, "I have almost 200 yuan now, but if I can't raise more than one pig a year, I'll be 60 before I can look for a wife. Do they want me to dream about women for the rest of my life?" Father inhaled deeply on his cigarette. I could see him fighting himself, his forehead raked with worry. He had no answer. Suddenly, Guo Lucky Wealth exclaimed, "I know, old Liang. You're an educated man. You can write a letter to Chairman Mao. Explain it to him. Maybe he doesn't understand." Father smiled ruefully. "My countrymen, I've been around trouble for many years, but I've never been able to do anything about it." He sighed deeply and was silent again. The weathered faces fell and moved back, murmuring among themselves. But I was staring at Father in astonishment. It was the first time in my life that I heard him fail to defend the party. Suddenly, every courtyard became a slaughterhouse and every man's hands were bloody. For the news spread that the commune had formed an Attack the Evil Winds of Capitalism team to enforce the new policies. Pig chases were held in and out of all 20 mud brick houses. 20 upon 20 screams of defeat echoed off the mountains. Frantic clucks bubbled up to the sun in thousands. Better to eat a lame hen yourself than surrender it to the government, the peasants reasoned. But of course, they couldn't really bear to eat that precious flesh. They smoked it and salted it and packed it away in earthenware jars to keep the way an old woman saves her pre-liberation dowry earrings by sewing them into her rice straw pillow. It was nearly a week later that Party Secretary Li, the brigade leader, came to conduct the evening meeting. He had gone first to our room to hear Father's report, and they were walking together to the meeting hall, taking the long route so he could check the newly transplanted rice seedings. I was trailing behind. Suddenly, old Li came to a horrified stop. 6 pretty white ducklings were swimming merrily through the water, feeding on the fresh green plants. "What incredible gall!" he exclaimed. "Old Liang, class struggle is everywhere, but this time they won't get away with it. Tonight, we'll make this a living example." They continued walking, the brigade leader punching Father excitedly on the shoulder as he made his plans. The ducks were Guo Laoda's, of course, the most intransigent member of the production team. A 38-year-old bachelor and an orphan, he had been in trouble ever since the early 1960s, when the floods had been so bad that he had gone to the county seat to beg. The Public Security Bureau had caught up with him because he had no residence card, and he was arrested and then sent back. Ever since then, there had been a black spot on his history, and whenever there was a new political movement, he was dragged out and made an example of, because in our team, the ex-landlords had died long ago. So tonight, he was to be the first on the chopping block. I felt a rush of pity, for he often came to our house and I liked his eccentric ways. He was in father's debt by many 10 cents, but he was an expert at the art of borrow, and never asked for more than 2 at a time, making up the modesty of his request and the frequency of his visits. He always held the bills tightly in his hand, as if he could squeeze oil out of them, saying, "Wait until my ducklings are big, then you'll have a feast for an emperor." Father always answered him smiling, enjoying the ritual. "Don't kill any of them. Let them lay eggs. Then you can pay me back in cash." I found I had fallen quite behind father and his companion, and on a sudden impulse I made for Guo Lao Da's house at a run. He was blowing his cooking fire with a mouth bellows. "Guo Lao Da," I cried, "get your ducks out of the field. The brigade leader's seen them, and he's going to criticize you." Old Guo put his bellows down softly, his shaved head gleaming in firelight. "Fuck this," he swore tonelessly, as if stating a fact. "Can a party secretary eat me up? If my ducks like the fields, let them stay here. They're not bothering anyone." "You should go," I insisted. "This is serious." 6 ducks have a nibble on public land. Well, who knows how much public food that father has eaten, dropping in everywhere at meal times. We poor peasants don't know how to write, but we keep our accounts with our bellies. I didn't dare stay away any longer. "My father would want you to go," I said, and slipped out. That evening, old Li seemed even more pleased with himself than usual. "In our movement to cut off the tail of capitalism, we have achieved great victories," he announced. "But there are still many problems. The situation is especially grave in the number 9 production team." He paused and looked around for emphasis. Then he bellowed, "Guo Lao Da's ducks are an example of rotten capitalism." He paused again. "Guo Lao Da, stand up and ask Chairman Mao for forgiveness." Guo Lao Da had been sitting in the front row. Now he got slowly to his feet. He looked big and gawky up there in front of everyone. But his rage gave him a strange kind of grace. "What makes you think your cock is any bigger than anyone else's?" he shouted in his thick regional dialect. "If I'm going to do it, I'll do it. But it's to Chairman Mao, not to you." And in a flash, before I had time to decipher his words, he was down on all fours in front of the poster, knocking his head on the earthen floor with 3 loud thumps that could be heard all over the room. We all had to laugh. He had stood up to the brigade leader so bravely, but he looked so foolish down there on the ground. Old Li was furious. "Hey you, don't you think it's over just because you did it? If you don't kill these ducks tonight, we'll bring your case to the entire commune." I never dreamed that this undereducated peasant would render a party secretary speechless, but he did. "Do you know whose ducks these are?" he demanded, shaking his finger. "These ducks are Chairman Mao's ducks. One is for old Liang to repay my debt to him, but I'm sending the other 5 to Peking for Chairman Mao to eat. And whoever is crazy enough to try to kill my ducks, well, he's the one opposing Chairman Mao." We roared again with laughter. This was even better than a comic performance. The brigade leader was absolutely helpless. Finally, he said, "If we can't settle this matter tonight, we'll settle it soon enough." But as the peasants filed out of the meeting room, I heard him mutter to father, "Old Liang, this business, I'll put you in charge of it." It was his admission of defeat. Father and Auntie Zhu were about to go to bed when Guo Lao Da came to our house, a changed man. The bravado was all gone. "Old Liang," he said, his voice deeply troubled, "what shall I do? My ducks have supported my whole life. Do they want us to starve to death to fight capitalism?" "Hush," whispered father. "They could blow out your brains for saying less." Then we spoke softly with him until the fire burned down very low. I was already asleep in the kitchen when Guo Lao Da went out to kill his ducks. Although father resolved this incident peacefully, The next one was worse. It was the hungry time when green and yellow don't meet. One crop was gone and the next still unripe. Even our family ate squash, for none of us wished to be the only ones with rice on the table. We loaned out what we had and tightened our belts like everyone does. Most of the capitalist hogs had already been turned into preserved meat. The 20 yuan each had represented now a dream of the past. Only our hosts still had 2 pigs grunting in their attached sty, plump, lively, and nurtured like babies. Old Guo's wife would still spend hours carrying in wild grasses and the special vegetables to which they had devoted part of their plot, chopping them fine with a cleaver in each hand and simmering them lovingly into an edible slop. Perhaps it was because the couple had been so generous to us that father closed his eyes to this violation of the rules. Then one night after we were all asleep, a loud explosion shook the house. Cooking utensils fell off the kitchen wall by my bed, and I was showered with mud brick dust. The bed itself trembled. Clad as I was in my undershorts, I ran outside. A loud wailing came from the pigsty. "Murderers! Doglons! Wolfhards! Oh, my precious pigs!" Father was holding up a lantern. Half of the sty was gone, and the pigs were lying bloodily in the debris. Old Guo's wife had thrown herself over their bodies, sobbing as if she had lost the sons she never had. The neighbors came running, the women's breasts bulbous and luminous in the dim light, the men's ribs patterns of light and dark. Guo Lucky Wealth stood there, dazed, clutching the broken wall where it came to his shoulder. He seemed not to hear the angry words of the crowd. "God damn the attack the evil winds of capitalism team. So they're helping themselves to the military's grenades now." Then Zhu Zhidao came out. She had taken the time to dress and surprisingly seemed more self-possessed than anyone else. "Come, Sister Guo," she said, pulling the weeping woman up. "You won't bring them back that way." In her distraction, Guo's wife's attention was drawn into the lantern father was holding up, and then to father himself. "Old Liang," she cried, grasping his hand in her bloody ones. "You must speak for me. Be my judge. How can we live now?" It must have been the immediacy of the trouble and his concern for the people involved that blinded father to the fact that this was a question of party policy. Or perhaps it was the fact that he had been awakened from a deep sleep and his sensors were not functioning properly. Something exploded inside him, something that he had been trying to silence for more than 12 years. "I'll go," he cried. "I'll go find the Commune Party secretary this minute." 4 of us started out. Guo Lucky Wealth, his older brother, team leader Guo, father, and myself as lantern bearer. It was a journey full of stumbles and falls for father in his nearsighted fury, and when we came to the nearby number 10 production team, he paused and announced, "We'll get company leader Dai to come with us. Then they'll really listen." Company leader Dai was not happy about being awakened, but even so he expressed his sympathy for the peasants. 4 cadres had already come to see him, he said, to protest the attack the evil winds of capitalism team's use of weapons to kill animals. "We can use persuasion," he said. "There's no need to use terror and violence." Father shocked me by disagreeing even with that concession. "That woman didn't have a grain of rice," he said excitedly. "She's been ill for a long time and never had money to see a doctor. Those pigs were so close to being fat enough to sell. Within a week, she could have had 40 yuan, enough to pay her debts and more. Why shouldn't she raise an extra pig?" Oh, Dai, Chairman Mao didn't mean for his policies to harm the peasants, did he? "Come on, let's go to the Commune Party secretary." Old Dai looked at him as if he were crazy and assumed an official tone. "Let me remind you that we are cadres who had been sent down to the countryside for re-education. We have no right to interfere with local affairs. Control yourself, old Liang. Calm down. Here, smoke a cigarette and maybe you'll see things more rationally. Father looked back at the men who had rested all their hopes on him. They were standing well back in the shadows, defeat already on their faces. He mopped his dripping face with his handkerchief. "We'll do things according to established precedent," said old Dai crisply. "We'll report the situation when we have our meetings next week. It's senseless to go running around in the middle of the night. Now go home and go back to sleep." It was an order from a superior. Father had done his best. Of course, no one did anything to compensate Guo Lucky Wealth's wife for the loss of her pigs. Chairman Mao's policies had been carried out, and that was all that mattered. Finally, Father took 40 yuan out of his own pocket and made Guo Lucky Wealth's wife take it. "For rent and services," he said. It wasn't before long the country leaders realized the city cadres were not dependable enforcers of policy. Like Father, they were all too likely to sympathize with the peasants they knew. But if they couldn't be trusted to carry out policies in their own teams, they could be reassigned in groups to teams where they had no personal relationships. There they could supervise each other and still be of use in cutting off the tail of capitalism. So in late summer, when we had been in countryside for more than half a year, the cadres were organized into struggle, criticize, reform propaganda teams. Father was among those drafted. Father's happy days were really over now. The economic situation was getting worse and worse, yet he was responsible for overseeing the ruinous policies. He spent months at a time with other production teams, while other cadres came over to our team. It worked. Fearful of receiving bad reports themselves, the cadres spent their time ensuring that no extra animals were raised and full government quotas were turned in, keeping records of each peasant's political enthusiasm, making sure that rice shoots were arranged with a government-prescribed distance between rows and between plants, and, of course, continuing and strengthening the Chairman Mao worship activities. They were in charge of punishing those who sold things privately and those who went up to the mountain to cut firewood on government land. Criticism meetings and docked work points were now the order of the day. Finally, they sat in judgment over those who began to steal because they were too poor to feed themselves. This phenomenon, the propaganda team announced vindictively, was the ugly head of class struggle revealing itself. The difficulty